So they come to this spot on the southern side of this island of Crete, and it's near the Fair Havens, near Lasea. Now, when much time was spent, because it took us way longer than we thought because the winds were not working for us, and we've delayed. How much? It says, sailing was now dangerous because the fast was now already past. So the fast would be Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, which happens late September, early October, depending on the lunar cycle of that year. So it's the beginning of what we would call today the fall season. Well, sailing on the Mediterranean Sea, starting in late September, early October, after the fast, after Yom Kippur, notoriously dangerous. And we've seen that it's been rough just getting to that point. So at this stage, it says, Paul admonished them. So Paul stands up. Oh, and keep in mind, let's put this in context. If you look over at verse 37, take a quick peek ahead, you find out that there are 216 souls on the ship, Luke and Paul being two of those. So there's 276 people. That gives you a sense of the size and the scope and the scale of this group of sailors, soldiers, and prisoners, and other passengers that we don't know about.
Yeah, this is not a small Galilean fishing ship. And so when the storms arise here, it is very serious. So
in this group, picture it, 276. For those of you in a regular-sized ward, picture about 276 in a sacrament meeting, one person standing up and saying, Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with hurt and much damage, not only of the lading and ship, but also of our lives. Now, can I just say that for most of the 275 other people on that ship, this would have been very odd to have a prisoner stand up and say that. It's like, who do you think you are? And why should I listen to you? Well, watch what happens. This is fascinating. This is one of my favorite lessons of all of the scriptures on the principle of follow the prophet. Verse 11 starts by saying, nevertheless, in spite of what Paul just said, the centurion believed the master and the owner of the ship more than those things which were spoken by Paul. Are you seeing? Let's turn to the experts of the world. Let's turn to the guy who owns the ship and who's in charge of the ship and ask him. And it says, verse 12, because the Fair Havens, or the haven, was not commodious to winter in. So if we stay here, like Paul's suggesting, in the Fair Havens, we have to spend the winter here, and it's not commodious. It's going to be very uncomfortable. The more part advised to depart thence also, if by any means they might attain to Phenice, and there to winter, which is in the haven of Crete, and lie toward the southwest and northwest. Now, notice this. If we can just limp our way in this boat over to this westernmost end of Crete, then we can get to this city, Phenice. It's a much better place to stay. It will be commodious to winter in, is the principle here. Oh, and let's add one more verse. And when the south wind blew softly. Did you catch that? There's this gentle south breeze blowing. And I'm not a sailor, but I know enough about sailing that if you're in that location, trying to get to that location, probably one of the best breezes you could have would be a gentle south breeze, because then you just put your sails at that 45-degree angle. That gentle south breeze hits that sail and just tucks you along that coastline over to Phenice, and it's just a pleasant afternoon ride. Everything's great. Are you noticing? All of the experts say go. we don't want to spend winter here, so we would prefer not to stay. Oh, and the gentle soft breeze is telling me it's perfect, which would cause me to look at Paul and think, what does he know? He's crazy. And so they disregard his counsel. Verse 14 opens with an interesting word, but. Brothers and sisters, can I suggest that every time you and I choose to go against what the prophets have counseled us to do, anytime that we stack up a list of all the reasons why we're right and they may be wrong, or why they may be misinformed, or not completely understand our situation, or have our best interest in mind, whatever it may be, anytime we go against what they say, mark it. There's going to be a verse in our own journal that will start with the word but. In this case, but not long after, there arose against it a tempestuous wind called Euroclydon. Euroclydon being an east wind. And you'll notice that throughout scriptures, including the Book of Mormon, an east wind is always a wind of destruction, a wind that brings with it death, a wind that is, you lose control, which is exactly what happens in this ship. Verse 15, it says, when the ship was caught and could not bear up into the wind, we let her drive. We just needed to go this little teeny distance and we had the safety of the shore right on our right-hand side. But because of this violent east wind, this Euroclydon, we no longer have control of the ship, so we now have to let her drive. Isn't that a beautiful principle in the gospel of Jesus Christ, that there's safety in following the prophets? It doesn't mean that we're not going to have major storms, but we're going to be able to weather those storms better. They would have been at the Fair Havens when this terrible storm came. And yeah, it might not have been a very commodious winter, but they wouldn't have experienced all these struggles that we're about to read about coming up. So they now lose control. They no longer can use their agency to decide what to do with the ship. So they let her drive. And running under a certain island, which is called Clauda, we had much work to come by the boat, which when they had taken up, they used helps, undergirding the ship, fearing lest they should fall into the quicksands. They strake sail, and so were driven. So it's just getting worse and worse and worse. So what do we have to do? The next day, they lightened the ship. And the third day, they cast out with their own hands the tackling of the ship. These things, the back of the Fair Havens, everybody would have said, ooh, that is essential for our voyage on the sea. You have to have the tackling of the ship. Well, now, things that you thought were essential are weighing you down, and they're saying, we're going to die. We're going to sink because of this storm and the waves that are coming in. We have to lighten the ship, lighten the load. We have to simplify our life. So they start throwing out things that before were seen as essential. And when neither the sun nor the stars in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope that we should be saved was then taken away. At this point, everybody's sitting there saying, we're dead. We're all going to die. All hope is taken away. Don't you love what happens in verse 21? Paul stood up after long abstinence, and he said, Sirs, ye should have hearkened unto me, and not have loosed from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss. So he doesn't dwell on that, but he reminds them, I kind of warned you that this would happen. And now I exhort you to be of good cheer. Don't you love that? That this great apostle, speaking for the Lord now, the exhortation to the group is, be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. I don't know about you, but if I'm in a ship that big with 276 people, and now this guy who had told us not to leave and we left, now we're having struggles, if he stood up and said, I'm gonna make a promise. We're gonna lose the ship, but we're not gonna lose anybody's life. None of the 276 of us are going to die. Speaking for myself, I would have had a really hard time believing that if I'm just a a random passenger on this ship. But I love the response here. He tells them why. Verse 23, for there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve, saying, fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar, and lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God that it shall be with us, even as it was told me. Can you see a pattern? That God's prophets, one of their messages is to be of good cheer. Put your focus on the Lord. Trust in his promises. They're sure. And so he said, we're going to be cast upon a certain island. And then verse 27 says, but when the 14th night was come, as we were driven up and down in Adria, about midnight, the shipmen deemed that they drew near to some country. So they sense it's nighttime, so they sounded, which means they drop that weight down in, and it's got a rope with knots tied every so many feet, and they can tell how far down the seafloor is. And then they sound again, and they realize we are coming into land. We're getting closer to something. So they put down the anchors, and they wait for the day. And at that point, you can picture a group of the sailors getting together saying, this is our chance. Let's get out of here. Verse 30, the shipmen were about to flee out of the ship, and when they had let down this lifeboat into the sea, under the color as though they would have cast anchors out of the foreship. We're just going down here to go and get the anchors out of the front. Paul knows what's happening. And so he said to the centurion and to the soldiers, except these abide in the ship, ye cannot be saved. You'll notice what's happened now with our centurion and our soldiers. They don't question Paul anymore. They trust him completely. So they run over, and the soldiers cut off the ropes of the boat and let her fall off, preventing these shipmen, these sailors, from getting in and getting to land on their own. And so then Paul tells them, everybody eat up. Everybody eat. Not a hair of your head is going to fall from any of you. None of you are going to be harmed. And when he had thus spoken, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. Then were they all of good cheer. And they also took some meat. And we were all in the ship, 260 souls. So now we lighten the ship, and the next morning when the sun comes up, the ship's lighter, so we can get in and closer to this island, which we find out later is Malta. And the ship gets torn apart. But all of the people get into the water. Some grab wood, others swim to shore on their own. And instead of killing them, like the soldiers said in verse 42, the centurion, willing to save Paul, commanded that they which could swim should cast themselves first in the sea and get to land, and the rest came to shore on boards. So the centurion refused to let the soldiers kill the prisoners because he has learned to trust what Paul says. I imagine that if that centurion were here today, he might remind us of the power that comes from not trusting in the arm of flesh, or trusting in our own preferences, or trusting in our own logic and reasoning, but putting faith in God, faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, by following the prophet and the seers and the revelators that God has chosen for the earth.